first thing I remember is the smell. Antiseptic and something else underneath it, something stale and recycled, the kind of air that's been breathed by too many people in too much distress. I couldn't open my eyes all the way. They felt like they were weighted down with something, like someone had pressed thumbs against my lids while I slept. I heard a machine beeping somewhere to my right. I heard someone crying, very quietly, trying not to be heard. I moved my fingers first. That's what they say to do, isn't it? Car accidents, concussions. You try the small things. My fingers moved. They touched something scratchy. A hospital blanket, the thin kind that never actually keeps you warm. Mom. The crying was my mother. I'd know that sound anywhere. She cried at commercials, at the end of every phone call when I moved away for school and my wedding. This was different. This was the kind of crying she only did when something had actually broken. I tried to say her name and what came out was a dry, cracked noise like stepping on a twig. She stopped crying immediately. I felt the chair scrape and then her hand was on my arm, cool and trembling, and I finally got my eyes to open, or mostly open. The ceiling was white and textured. A fluorescent light buzzed above me. My mother's face appeared in my field of vision, blurred at the edges, and she looked terrified. Not relieved, terrified. That was the first thing that struck me as wrong. Your daughter wakes up, you're relieved, you cry differently, you say thank God. But her eyes were wide and darting, moving from me to the door, and she bent down very close to my ear and she whispered something that I've thought about every day since. Don't let them know you're awake. Please, not yet. I blinked at her. My brain was moving slowly, slogging through something thick. She gave me one tight, urgent nod, and I closed my eyes again. I heard the door open about 3 minutes later. My husband's mother walked in first. I'd know her voice anywhere. That particular brand of warmth she used in public, bright and carrying. Performed for whoever was listening. Any change? She said. Then my husband's father, the doctors aren't optimistic about today. And then quieter. The voice I actually loved and had believed in for 4 years. She's strong. She'll pull through. My husband, Graydon. He was standing 3 feet from me telling his parents she'd pull through and his voice was entirely flat. I lay still and I breathed slowly and I listened. It wasn't planned what happened next. I don't think they coordinated what to say in front of me because people who have just had their daughter-in-law in a car accident don't sit in the hospital room and talk about what they're going to do if she dies and what they're going to do if she doesn't. They don't discuss timelines. They don't say things like the paperwork is already in order and we just need to be patient a little longer. But that's what I heard. My mother-in-law's voice dropped, but not enough. If she doesn't improve in the next few days, we should think about calling Father Baymont, just to have him on file. Her husband murmured something I couldn't catch, and then Graydon, my husband, said, let's not jump ahead. We should focus on what's manageable right now. Not, I hope she's okay. Not, I love her. Not, I can't lose her. What's manageable? My mother's hand tightened on my arm so slightly that I was probably the only person who felt it. She knew I was awake. She was asking me to stay quiet a little longer. So I did. They stayed for 40 minutes. I tracked the conversation in pieces through the fog of whatever pain medication was moving through my IV. There was something about a property in Kelowna. Something about a name I didn't recognize. A woman's name, said only once. Said carefully, the way you say a name you've practiced, not saying in certain company. There was something about when things settle, and it was always going to come to this eventually. When they left, my mother waited until she heard the elevator, and then she sat down next to me and pressed her forehead against my hand and said, I'm so sorry, baby. I didn't know how to warn you, and I didn't have any proof. I opened my eyes properly for the first time. Tell me everything, I said. My name is Wren. I know that's an unusual name. My mother was a birdwatcher. She'll tell you more about it than you want to know. I grew up in Ottawa, studied finance at Carleton, spent 3 years in Toronto at a consulting firm before I moved back because my father got sick and I never really left again. I was 31 when I met Graydon at a fundraiser for a children's hospital, The kind of event where everyone is dressed up and performing their best version of themselves. He was charming. He was funny. He came from money but wore it lightly, or seemed to. We dated for 2 years, and he asked me to marry him on a hiking trail outside Gatineau in October, and I said yes, and I meant it completely. What I didn't know, what I would learn much later, in pieces and then all at once in the hospital room, was that I had been selected, not chosen the way you choose someone you love, selected the way you select a business asset. The Hardcastle family had a complicated financial situation that nobody outside their inner circle knew about. Graydon's parents had made a series of bad investments in the late 2010s, a real estate venture in Alberta that went sideways, money moved offshore improperly, debts that existed under different names. What they needed, specifically, was a spouse for Graydon who brought in enough legitimate income and assets to serve as a buffer. Someone whose financial footprint was clean and uncomplicated. Someone who could be married quietly into the family structure without asking too many questions. I had a good income. I had a condo I'd owned outright since I was 28. I had my father's inheritance, which I'd invested carefully and grown steadily. I was, from the outside, exactly what they needed. My mother told me this in the hospital room while I stared at the ceiling and tried to hold my face still. She'd suspected for almost a year. She'd noticed small things. The way Graydon's father looked at her sometimes, assessing, like he was calculating something. A conversation she'd overheard at Christmas 2 years ago between him and Graydon. Something about timelines and asset consolidation. Words that seemed strange in the middle of a holiday dinner. She hadn't said anything because she didn't have anything concrete, and she knew how much I loved him, and she was afraid of being the mother who drove her daughter away by being too suspicious. She was telling me this now because 2 days ago, while I was unconscious, she had overheard Graydon's mother on the phone in the hallway outside my room saying, "She signed everything before the accident. It doesn't matter what happens now." I signed everything before the accident. My mouth had gone dry. What did I sign? My mother looked at her hands. I don't know exactly, but Graydon brought paperwork home about 6 weeks ago. You told me you'd been reviewing some joint financial documents. I remembered that. He'd called them reallocation forms. He'd said they were related to a joint account he wanted to set up for our future long-term planning, tax efficiency. He'd explained it in the way he explained things. Patient, reasonable, slightly above my level, so I felt grateful for the simplification. I'd been tired. I'd been in the middle of a difficult quarter at work. I'd signed. I'm a financial analyst. I've spent 10 years reading documents for a living, and I signed paperwork my husband put in front of me without reading it carefully because I trusted him, because it felt insulting to treat your marriage like a business transaction. That's the part that still sits in my chest like a stone. The accident happened on a Tuesday. I was driving home from work on the 417 when a pickup truck ran a red at an intersection in Kanata and hit me on the driver's side. The police report said it was straightforward. Driver ran the light, my car took the impact, airbags deployed, I hit my head against the window frame. They said I was lucky. The other driver had a suspended license and no insurance and had been drinking at 2 in the afternoon. What the police report did not say, what nobody said to me officially for several weeks, was that 2 people had called 911 in the minute before the crash to report the same pickup truck driving erratically, and that the truck had been in my general vicinity for nearly 10 minutes, following the same route. This came out later in a different context, and by the time it did, I was already several steps ahead of where anyone expected me to be. I stayed in the hospital for 4 more days. In those 4 days, I did 3 things. The first thing I did was call my work colleague, Priya, who I trusted completely and who had a background in contract law before she moved into finance. I described from memory everything I could recall about the paperwork I'd signed, the terminology Graydon had used, the general structure of the document, the specific phrasing I remembered from the pages I did glance at. Priya was quiet for a long time and then she said, "Ren, I think you need to talk to a lawyer before you talk to your husband." The second thing I did was start a notes document on my phone, behind a passcode Graydon know, and I wrote down everything I'd heard in that hospital room. Every name, every phrase, The timeline references. The timeline references. The name that had been said once. Carefully, I wrote it all while it was still fresh. In the flat, clinical way I write meeting notes at work. The third thing I did was call my own bank. The news was not good. 3 weeks before the accident, a joint account had been opened in both our names. I had not consciously participated in this, which meant either my signature had been forged, or Graydon had taken documents from my home office without my knowledge. A significant transfer had been made from my personal savings into this joint account shortly after. The account had Graydon's mother listed as a secondary contact. I was not the primary contact. I was not listed as having initiated the transfer. I was listed as having initiated the transfer. I was listed as having authorized it. I sat in my hospital bed and looked out the window at the November sky. That particular gray that settles over Ottawa in November like it's making a permanent decision. And I thought about the version of myself who had gotten into her car 3 weeks after signing unknown documents. And I felt something shift in my chest, not grief, not yet, something colder than grief. Something that felt like clarity. I was discharged on a Friday. Graydon came to pick me up. He was warm. He was attentive. He carried my bag and held the door and told me I looked beautiful even with the bruising along my jaw. And in the car, he held my hand the whole way home. I let him. I talked about nothing. I asked about the cat, whether she'd been eating. I asked about the neighbor's renovation. I sounded, I think, like someone who had been in a car accident and was tired and glad to be home. That night, after he fell asleep, I got up and went to my home office and I sat at my desk with the door closed for 3 hours. I'd booked an appointment with a lawyer named Terry for the following Monday. Terry came recommended by Priya, and more importantly, she was not connected in any way to Graydon's family or their network. The Hardcastle family had a long reach in certain Ottawa circles. Old money, old names, the kind of connections that made people defer without realizing they were deferring. I needed someone outside that. In my home office, that night I made a list of everything I had, everything I needed. I had my phone notes. I had my bank statements, which I'd requested copies of and had sent to my mother's address, not mine. I had my memory of the hospital room conversation, which was clear and specific. I'd been a financial analyst for 10 years. I was trained to retain numerical and verbal information under pressure. I had one other thing, which I hadn't told anyone yet. Graydon kept a laptop in his home office that I had technically never used. But 3 months into our marriage, during a period when my own laptop was in for repair, I'd used his briefly to print something. He'd been in a hurry and had given me the password casually, the way you do when it's your spouse and you're not thinking about it as a security risk. He'd never changed it. I knew because I'd seen him type it since then. The same sequence, same slight hesitation on the third character. That night, I opened Graydon's laptop. I want to be clear about something. I was not looking for evidence of an affair, which is what people assume when a wife goes to her husband's things. I was looking for financial documents. I was looking for whatever I'd signed. I was looking for the paperwork that Graydon's mother had referred to on the phone. What I found was more than that. There was an email thread with his father going back 14 months. The language was careful. The way people are careful when they know what they're discussing is problematic. Lots of references to the arrangement and the timeline and the situation with Ren. There were references to the joint account. There was a document attached to one of the emails that was a draft of exactly what I'd signed, a financial consolidation agreement that, buried in the third section, contained a clause allowing Graydon to act as sole administrator of all jointly held assets in the event that I became incapacitated or otherwise unable to manage financial affairs. The clause had a specific definition of incapacitation that included, and I had to read this 3 times, extended hospitalization. I had signed this 6 weeks before a car accident that put me in extended hospitalization. There was something else in the email thread. Near the beginning, 14 months ago, Graydon's father had written, "The Kelowna property needs to come out of your mother's name before next spring." We discussed the advantage of using Ren's profile for the transfer. She has no business connections to the property and her income documentation is clean. Once she's on title, we move the liability. I'd never been to Kelowna in my life. I screenshot everything onto my phone. I closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it. I went back to bed and lay in the dark next to my husband. And I thought about the hiking trail in Gatineau in October, the leaves, the question he'd asked me. I thought about how thoroughly and completely I had believed him. In the morning, I made him coffee and I asked if he'd slept well, and he said yes. The appointment with Terry on Monday changed things substantially. She reviewed the financial consolidation agreement with the kind of focused quiet that good lawyers have. Not reacting, just absorbing. And when she looked up, she said, "This was designed to be signed without being read. It's intentionally formatted to look like standard spousal financial planning." She paused. "Do you want to know what your options are, or do you want to know how bad it is first?" I said I wanted both. The bad news, Graydon had, in the weeks before the accident, successfully moved nearly $60,000 out of my personal savings into the joint account. Because I had signed the consolidation agreement, which contained the incapacitation clause, he had technically had the authority to act on my behalf during my hospitalization. He had also added his mother's name to a property transfer involving the condo I'd owned outright since I was 28. The transfer had been initiated the day after the accident, when I was still unconscious. The condo I'd owned outright since I was 28. The options, the consolidation agreement could be challenged on the grounds of misrepresentation, specifically, that the document's purpose had been misrepresented to me at the time of signing, that I had not been given independent legal advice, and that certain provisions had been actively concealed through formatting. In Ontario, this was not a guaranteed win, but it was a credible argument. The property transfer involving my condo could be challenged more strongly, because it had been initiated while I was legally incapacitated, which meant Graydon had used the clause he had tricked me into signing in order to conduct a transaction I had never discussed or agreed to. Terry also said very carefully, "There's something else you should consider filing. You mentioned the accident and the phone calls to 911 about the other vehicle. If you have any reason to believe that the accident was not entirely accidental, that's a different kind of conversation." I thought about Graydon's father's email, the timeline, the accident moving things forward. I thought about Graydon in the hospital room saying what's manageable. "Yes," I said, "I'd like to have that conversation." The following weeks were the strangest of my life. I was, to all appearances, a woman recovering from a car accident, navigating some fatigue, going to physiotherapy twice a week for my neck and shoulder, working from home part-time. Graydon was present and attentive. His parents came for dinner twice. His mother brought soup. I watched her move around my kitchen, the kitchen in my condo, the one she had just had her name added to, and I smiled and said the soup was wonderful. Terry was working in the background. She'd flagged the consolidation agreement to a financial fraud specialist. She'd requested the full documentation trail for the Kelowna property. She'd connected with the officer handling the accident investigation, who had been separately looking into the other driver's movements that day, and had made some interesting discoveries about the route the truck had taken. I was working in the background too. I'd kept the screenshots from Graydon's laptop. I'd been quietly gathering my own financial records, reconstructing what I'd had before the account changes, documenting the timeline of every transaction. My mother, who had come to stay with me for a few weeks during recovery, was the only person who knew what I was actually doing. She sat at my kitchen table in the evenings drinking tea while I worked, and she didn't say much, but sometimes she put her hand over mine and squeezed, and that was enough. The name I'd heard said once in the hospital room, carefully, quickly, turned out to belong to a woman in Vancouver. Graydon had known her for 3 years. The emails were not extensive, but they were clear enough. I noted this and set it aside. It mattered legally in some contexts, and not at all in others, and I had learned by then to sort information by its usefulness. On a Thursday morning in January, Terry filed a formal application to void the financial consolidation agreement. She filed simultaneously to reverse the property transfer. She sent Graydon's lawyer a package of the supporting documentation, which included the email thread from his father's account. Priya had a contact who was helpful in a professional capacity, and the analysis of the consolidation agreement's misleading formatting. Graydon called me that afternoon. I was at my mother's kitchen table by then. I'd moved out 2 weeks earlier, quietly, efficiently, taking what was mine and leaving everything else. He sounded like someone who had just realized the floor he'd been standing on was not where he thought it was. "Ren," he said, "we should talk about this." "We are talking," I said. "I mean in person. I can explain." "I know what you can explain," I said. "I read the emails, Graydon." There was a long silence. My parents were involved in something I didn't fully. "You sent the emails," I said. "You drafted the agreement. You were in that hospital room talking about timelines." I kept my voice level. "I had practiced this. I'm not angry with you. I want you to understand that. I'm something else entirely." He didn't have anything to say to that. The legal process took several months. The consolidation agreement was voided. The property transfer was reversed. The $60,000 was a longer fight. It came back, eventually, minus some legal fees, which I considered a reasonable cost. The Kelowna property situation involved Graydon's parents more directly and became a separate investigation. I wasn't part of that process, but I provided documentation when asked. The accident investigation found insufficient evidence to lay criminal charges related to the accident itself. The other driver maintained he had simply run a light while impaired, which was consistent with his record, and there was no direct proof of coordination with Graydon or his family. I have my own views on this. I wrote them in that notes document, and I have kept the document, and I check it sometimes late at night, the way you check something you're not ready to let go of. Graydon and I divorced in the spring. It was not dramatic by the time we got there. The papers were signed with an efficiency that felt slightly surreal. We sat in Terry's office and we signed what we needed to sign, and that was it. He looked tired. I felt tired. Neither of us said anything meaningful. My mother threw me a small dinner when it was final. Just a few people, Priya, 2 friends from university, my cousin who drove in from Kingston for the occasion. My mother made her brisket and opened the good wine, and at some point in the evening, someone asked me how I was doing, really, and I thought about it seriously before I answered. "I think I'm okay," I said, and I meant it mostly. My condo sold in August. I used the proceeds to pay off my mother's house. She'd been carrying a small mortgage since my father died, and it had been bothering me for years. I rented a place in Westboro, close enough to the river that I can walk there on weekend mornings. And I've been doing that. I've been walking by the river a lot. Last week, I got a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, smooth and practiced, saying she was a journalist who had been following a story related to a family I would know, and she'd love to speak with me about my experience if I was willing. I listened to the message twice. I thought about Terry, who had told me at the start of this that the best outcomes come from patience and documentation and staying calm when everyone around you expects you not to be. I thought about my mother in that hospital room, her cool, trembling hand on my arm, the 4 words she'd whispered to me that changed everything. I deleted the voicemail. I blocked the number. I poured myself a coffee and I sat by the window watching the street below. The November gray settling in again over the city, and I thought, I know what I have. I know what I kept. That's enough. I keep coming back to the moment my mother pressed her forehead against my hand in that hospital room. Not the emails. Not the courtroom paperwork. That moment, her hand shaking, her voice down to almost nothing, 4 words that cost her something to say. That's the image I return to when I try to make sense of everything that happened. There's a version of this story where I never wake up in time, where I go home from the hospital, sign a few more things, keep making his coffee in the mornings, and only figure out what was happening when it was too late to do anything about it. That version isn't dramatic. It just quietly closes around you. I think about how close I came to that version, and it steadies me in a way that's hard to explain. What I've learned, and I mean really learned, not just as something you say after something hard, is that the people who took from me were only able to do it because I stopped paying attention to my own instincts. There were signs, not hidden ones. Graydon's father at Christmas, calculating. The paperwork explained too smoothly, too fast. The way certain questions I asked, got turned into jokes and then dropped. I noticed all of it and I filed it under. I'm being paranoid because I wanted to believe in the version of my life I'd chosen. That's not weakness, exactly, but it is a kind of negligence towards yourself, and it's one I won't repeat. My mother used to tell me that being a decent person isn't the same as being a passive one. I didn't fully understand that until I was lying in a hospital bed deciding whether to let the people who had just hurt me keep believing they'd won. Decency, she meant, doesn't ask you to be small, it asks you to be honest about what's happening, about what you owe yourself, about what you're willing to accept. Graydon's family operated by a different understanding of the world, one where other people are resources to be managed. I don't need to hate them for that, but I am allowed to refuse it completely. The intelligence piece, and I don't mean that arrogantly, was just the discipline to stay clear when everything in me wanted to fall apart. To keep notes, to call Priya, to open that laptop, to walk into Terry's office and ask the right questions instead of the comfortable ones. I'd spent 10 years building those instincts professionally, and I almost didn't use them when they mattered most. That's the thing nobody tells you about being capable. Capability doesn't protect you automatically. You have to decide to use it on yourself, for yourself, especially when it's painful. The perseverance wasn't glamorous, it was just continuing. Getting up, going to physio, making lists at my mother's kitchen table at night, not letting the exhaustion talk me into stopping. The months between that hospital room and the final paperwork were long and unglamorous, and I cried in my car in parking lots more than once, but I kept going. And Ren, the version of me on the other side of all of it, gets to live in an apartment near the river and walk on weekend mornings and own her own life again, completely, without anyone else's name on it. That's enough. That has always been enough.